Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to do a video on 3 baits that you need to try this April. And of course, these aren't all the baits that I'm going to have tied on in April for any given fishery, but these are 3 different baits that I've always got in my rod box ready to go. And I think that they're pretty awesome. And for the most part, April is all about the spawn. A lot of the country, this is when the bass are going to start spawning. This is the biggest waves. Of course, you know, go down to Florida or, you know, Texas, the most southern parts of the country, the fish are going to be spawning a little bit earlier, maybe even January, February. But April is usually a big spawning month for a big swath of the entire country. So these are baits that really target that shallower range. So this is one of my favorite times to fish. So the very first bait, this one right here is actually one of the first ones that I reach for in my rod locker just to cover water. You know, I love covering water. I'm a shallow water power fisherman. I like casting thousands of times in a day and just keeping that motor guide on high. But this right here, a swim jig, and you can use a lot of different colors. You know, white is always really good, especially when you're around the shad spawn. But also bluegill. You know, when the fish are around the beds, bluegill works really well. But a swim jig, this is a 3/8 ounce version of the snakehead swim jig from Z-Man, and I pair it with a lot of different trailers. Sometimes I use the diesel minnows from Z-Man, but we just came out with the turbo fatties last year, and the turbo fatties cut down to, you know, maybe 3.5, 4 inches is perfect for a swim jig. It looks amazing in the water. So that's what I like to use on the back of this snakehead swim jig. And you know, this is just a bait that allows you to cover a lot of water, you know, and really get those reaction strikes out of fish around shallow cover. So I'm throwing this around, you know, reeds in the backs of these pockets where the fish are spawning. I throw it around lay downs, you know, I skip it underneath overhanging trees. I fish it around grass. It's just a great bait to be able to cover a ton of water around cover. So swim jig is definitely a bait that you need to have tied on in April. The tackle that I use for a swim jig is pretty close to what I use for a chatterbait. I'm going to be using heavier tackle. I'm never going to go lighter than 15-pound test fluorocarbon. Generally, I'm fishing 15-pound or 20-pound red label from Seagar. You know, you want heavier line because you're going to be fishing this around cover, number one, and also you're going to be setting the hook pretty hard because you're going to be pretty excited when you see that fish just come out of nowhere to attack this bait. So heavier line, I usually stick with 20-pound test unless I'm trying to get it a little bit deeper. So 20-pound or 15-pound red label fluorocarbon. I'm using a high-speed gear ratio reel with this. So we got the VLD10 I'm usually using, 7.2 to 1. This is actually nowadays a moderate speed gear ratio. It used to be a really fast one, but 7.2 to 1 is really good. I don't like using like the 8.1 to 1. I feel like I can overpower this bait and move it too fast sometimes. I generally like that 7.2 to 1. And then I use the same rod that I use for my chatterbait fishing, which is a 7.3 medium heavy Versa series from Fitzgerald. This is a really good moving bait rod. It's got a big, you know, strong backbone on it, but it also has a softer tip. It's almost a little bit more parabolic, it feels like. So it's really, really good for those reaction baits that you want to be able to lead those fish away from cover, but you also want that softer tip for good long casts and to get a good hook set. So swim jig is definitely on the short list. It's actually probably number 1 for general April fishing for me. All right, so let's go to the next one. So this one right here, finally in April, when things start warming up, that's when you can pick up a frog. Okay, so this right here is the Elite Frogs Poppin' version from Z-Man. I like the bigger of the two. You got the 2 2.25 inch size and the 2 3/4 inch size. This is the 2 3/4. This is the one that I generally use. But a poppin' frog is really good in April because, and it's probably my favorite time to throw a poppin' frog because, again, we're fishing for fish that are moving up to spawn, and they have smaller strike zones when they go up to spawn, and essentially their strike zone is represented by the bed that they're sitting on and protecting. And so you don't want a bait, especially like a topwater, to get out of that strike zone very fast. And a poppin' frog is perfect for making very accurate casts around like little points and reeds, little pockets and reeds, or any place that you think that a fish is going to be spawning and has a bed. This is where you can cast this poppin' frog and work it in one spot in that strike zone for a very, very long period of time. You can just walk it back and forth with just short, quick, pops of the rod tip, and it'll stay in one spot. So you don't want a bait like a buzz bait or something like that to move out of the strike zone very fast. I'm not saying a buzz bait isn't a great April bait, because it really, really is. But when the fish are on the bed, you want something that stays right over their head very, very long. So you can do that with a poppin' frog. So I love throwing a poppin' frog. In fact, I probably throw a poppin' frog during the spawn more than any other time of the year. And the leap frogs is a really, really good one. Again, as far as lure color, just match the hatch. Whatever the fish are feeding on. Generally, I'm going to be using something with a yellow belly, like this one right here. This is the old school color, and I like that orange or yellowish belly because it represents a bluegill, sunfish, something like that, very, very well. Of course, frog fishing, the tackle that we're going to be using, I generally like, because we're not fishing this poppin' frog on matted vegetation, we're actually fishing in open water or in and around cover. So you can get away with like a 7.3 medium heavy all-purpose series from Fitzgerald, but I like a 7.3 heavy action all-purpose series. So I like that heavier action, because these are big, thick hooks that you're trying to get, into the fish's mouth. So you need something that has a really, really solid backbone for it, and you're fishing just in and around heavy cover all the time anyways. So I like a shorter rod. It's a little bit different than if I'm fishing a frog over mats. Obviously I'm going to want something in the more like flippin' stick size class, but for this you want something a little bit shorter. A 7.3 is perfect. So medium heavy or heavy. Those are the two sizes that I like to use, or the two weights that I like to use. And then again, we're going to be using same exact reel that we used for the swim jig, 7.2:1 VLD10, or the FX8, or the 8.1:1 gear ratio VLD10. This is one that you can use that high speed gear ratio, those burner reels, to be more efficient, because you're just making real quick casts to cover, pop in a few times, reel it back in real fast, and make another presentation. And then the line that I'm going to be using no less than 50-pound braid, but usually for just spot casting and isolated cover, I'm not going to even go any higher than 50-pound braid. So 50-pound braid, 50-pound Seagar Smackdown, or the new Tactics. I actually like the Tactics a lot because I like that braided feel that it has. I feel like I get really good casts with it. So 50-pound braid, that's going to treat you right for the frog. So frog is definitely, the poppin' frog more specifically, is definitely a bait that I picked in April. All right, so the next bait that I think doesn't get nearly enough press or attention is a floating worm in April. A floating worm, you could use bubble gum, you can use white, you could use methylate. Methylate is by far my favorite color for a floating worm because it just has that perfect glow under the water, and I think it just pisses those fish off, and you get ferocious strikes from those fish. The only thing about a floating worm is really there is a very narrow window, extremely narrow window, where this bait is actually going to get those vicious strikes and to really catch a lot of fish on it. And that is around that April time period where those fish are just moving up to spawn. That is the window of opportunity for a floating worm. I use again the methylate. This is a 7-inch version version of a methylate floating worm. I've used some bigger ones as well, but essentially you're going to be fishing a floating worm just like you would a fluke or some type of jerk bait, you know, casting it around brush specifically. Brush is kind of key with a floating worm, so if you have a lake that has a lot of brush in the water, a lot of laydowns, things like that, it's going to pull those fish away from that cover and you're going to get those really vicious strikes. So again, fish it like a jerk bait. You're going to be casting to the cover, and man, you want to see a bass's strike zone get wider, throw one of these around where they're living and they just go crazy for it. So they'll go 10 feet to get that thing. But you're going to be Texas rigging it. I use, you know, depending on the size of the worm that you're using, 7-inch, you're going to want to use like a 4/0 hook, but I like to use the Hayabusa 956. It's a lighter wire EWG hook, and it works really well with this bait. So 4/0, 5/0, that's the size that you're going to want to use. I like to use that lighter hook, even though I'm fishing around cover. The rod that I'm going to be using it on, I generally like to use it on spinning gear. I'm just, you know, kind of old school when it comes to that. So I throw it on spinning gear. I like a 7.2 medium heavy Versus Series spinning rod. Of course, the S4000 spinning reel with 20-pound test Seagar smackdown braid, and sometimes I just tie the braid directly to the 956 and I don't even have a leader. Those fish they see red, man, and they go after it with reckless abandon, and they don't even, you know, they don't even care about the line. So they're not really line shy with this technique sometimes, but most times, just for insurance, I like to use like 12 or 15-pound test gold label fluorocarbon leader material on my braid. Again, you don't want to go too light because you're casting this in and around brush, so that's real important. So that is the floating worm. This is one that you definitely have to try. If this bite is going on, there's nothing else that you'd want to throw, because it's just absolutely insane how aggressive those fish get with the floating worm. So anyways, those are my some of my three favorite baits for April. So these are baits that I highly recommend that you try the next time you go out on your lake during April. Every single year, these are going to work at some point in time during that month. So anyways, guys, thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, drop a comment below, and I'm going to see you out on the water.